We're talking about the 1977 Japanese cult horror comedy classic House by Nobuhiko Obayashi. I don't even know where you start describing this thing. It is so singular. I mean, it's like one of the ultimate cult movies, wouldn't you say?
It kind of, for North Americans, it really just sort of popped into existence because it didn't really have a North American release for the longest time. I think in Japan it had been pretty well established as a cult film since its release, really. I think the Criterion Collection was the first North American distributor to actually give it a North American release, and at that time, once it came out here, it just sort of was like immediately it was the cult film. Like, everybody was talking about it. You were showing it to everybody when you got the Blu-ray, just like because you couldn't believe it. I think nobody could believe it, of like, where has this movie been for our whole lives?
It's got elements of almost every genre in it. Like, there's a little bit of teen melodrama, there's a little bit of like sentimental nostalgia picture, there's a little bit of romance, there's obviously horror, there's a lot of comedy, there's some musical, there's some animation. Like, it's unclassifiable, and it just seems to cram as much as you could possibly cram into an 80-minute movie. Brief rundown of the storyline. It's essentially a haunted house movie. It's about a small group of young women who go to stay with one of their aunts in a house in the woods. When they show up there, it's discovered that the aunt is actually an undead spirit. She died longing for her husband or her boyfriend to return from the war, and he never did. And so when she died, she put a curse on the house, and so now her spirit consumes all of the unmarried women who come into the house, which leads to all of them being picked off one by one in these outrageous, very creative ways. That's oversimplifying it a lot. There's a lot more to it. But that's kind of, I would say, like the basic concept that it goes with is it starts with the haunted house movie, and then what it builds on top of that is not like any other haunted house movie out there.
I think the more you watch the movie, I've only seen it this one time, but I have been going back and watching clips, and it's funny that the first time you see it, it is that experience of just being totally kind of baffled by it. I think the more you return to it and look, sort of have a context for what it is, and you sort of have a map of how to navigate it, it does make sense. I think like it does actually have an emotional resonance to it.
I don't think there's a single shot in this movie that doesn't have some kind of special effect, like some kind of matte painting or optical a combination of shots or animation or some kind of camera trick or shutter trick. It's pretty astounding, like just how much technique is thrown in there. Once you kind of absorb a portion of that, yeah, you do come back to it and you realize, oh, this isn't all just flash. It is actually contributing to a story that Obayashi is trying to tell.
Obayashi came from a commercial background, and it has very much that sensibility of, you know, how in a 30-second commercial, you have that much time to grab somebody's attention, have images stick in your mind. He really just does that, but to a feature-length extent of sustaining that sort of hyper subliminal imagery for an hour and a half. Just on that level alone, even if you don't really care for this particular kind of movie, I don't think anyone could accuse it of being boring. It's just something to really take a step back and marvel at in that way.
The project's genesis, the way it came about, is Toho was putting together a horror film, and they had been really inspired by the success of Jaws. They wanted to create their Jaws, essentially. And so they looked at Jaws and thought, okay, this is a big horror movie. It's directed by this young, hip director, Steven Spielberg. We need to find our Steven Spielberg, somebody young and hip and who can connect with the youth audience now. And so they hired Obayashi, who came from a background in experimental film and then, became very successful in advertising and directing commercials. From what I understand, like, they just gave him carte blanche to do whatever he wanted. So he took all of his avant-garde training, all of his commercial training, and actually in assembling the story and creating the screenplay, he went to his 11-year-old daughter and just asked her, what are things that scare you? What would you like to see in a horror movie? And so she just told him like about all of her dreams and nightmares and things that she remembered being scared of as a kid, and times like where her imagination played tricks on her, and she told him about being scared that the piano was going to eat her, and he turned that into a sequence, and saying she remembers somebody pulling a watermelon up from a well and thinking it was a severed head, and he took that and turned it into a sequence. It has a handmade quality that I really love about it too, that you get with like early Terry Gilliam or Sam Raimi. One great sequence that I think is like emblematic of the movie to an extent, it's when one of the characters is going, I mentioned it earlier, when they're going to pull the watermelon out of the well so that they can eat dessert. And it's done in this very sentimental, like musical kind of way, and it's very slow, and she's taking in the landscape saying, oh, it's so beautiful here. And then she pulls the watermelon out of the well and she realizes it's a severed head. And it's actually a really creepy image. Like, you do get genuinely creeped out in that moment. And then going right from there into the horror, then you go right into comedy when the head starts flying around and it bites her on the butt. And like, this all happens in the space of maybe like 2 minutes. And so you get 3 very contrasting tones all back to back with no transition. And that's part of the roller coaster that this movie takes you on.
It just really ping pongs you. It really kind of keeps shaking you and making you readjust how you're watching it.
I just love the guy who turns into bananas at the end. I mean, that just, I don't know if there's a context for that. It just seems to come out of nowhere, but it's so great. Like when he's asked, what's your favorite fruit? And he says, bananas. And then next time we see him, he's made of bananas. I don't know, but it's great.
He didn't realize he was setting his fate.
Yeah.
Whatever fruit he was going to name in that moment was going to be the rest of his existence. I think this would really work as like a children's movie. I know it was really popular with younger audiences in Japan when it came out, but as I was watching it, I think the whole tone of it and the whole aesthetic, even though it goes, kind of violent in some scenes and there's a lot of blood, there's nudity. I felt it has a kind of innocent quality to it, and a sort of clear artifice that I was thinking, like, this would be a great introductory horror film for a kid. Maybe not too young, but like maybe approaching teenage years, because it does have some edge. It does feel like it's kind of taboo in a lot of ways, of something you shouldn't be seeing, but it feels so safe on the other hand, and it feels so approachable from a child's perspective. It's the kind of thing that, the kind of material that it makes sense that a child would find something like that scary, because it is the kind of thing that you're sitting alone in a room and you're letting your imagination wander, and you see your family's grandfather clock in the corner ticking away, and a child is inevitably going to imagine getting stuck in the gears and all the like crazy things that are going on inside the clock that an adult would understand, but a child doesn't necessarily understand. Maybe it would be too scary for a kid in that way, because it does confirm, like, oh yeah, a mattress can just swallow you up if you're not careful. But
yeah,
I think there's just that sense of play and fun that I don't think it gets too intense, even at its bloodiest, even when the room is filling with blood. I don't think there's ever a moment where it crosses the line and becomes grotesque or disturbing.
It does come from a weirdly innocent place in the things it creates horror out of. I don't think anybody could even come close to replicating it. I think this is just one of those movies. It's going to be the only movie like it for all of time.